The race to the moon.
Delayed technological advancements.
In 1957, Sputnik 1 was launched by the Soviet Union. This was during the space race or race to the moon. The Soviet Union and the United States competed against each other to see who would be the first into space and then on the moon. During periods of detente between the two countries, there were opportunities for the Soviet Union and the United States to work together. If the Soviet Union and the United States had worked jointly using diplomacy rather than competition, technological advancements may have come sooner.
From the end of World War II until sometime in the late 1980s, the USSR and the USA were in a Cold War. This is when there's political hostility between different sides, generally between countries, but no open conflict. On October 4th, 1957, the USSR became the first to launch an artificial Earth satellite, Sputnik 1. This began a new phase of the Cold War, the space race, and the Soviets were in the lead.
At the time, there was no way to tell what Sputnik 1 was, and the U.S. military was worried that it could possibly be a way for the USSR to spy on them. Every 98 minutes for 22 days, as it circled the globe, Sputnik 1 reminded the world what it was with its signature beep. The Americans may have been worried that the Soviets were able to spy on them from space, but an even bigger worry was that it could have been a nuclear weapon.
At the end of World War II, the US and the Soviet Union both hired German rocket scientists and put them to work for their space agencies, and because the two countries did not trust each other, they both developed their own rocket programs. Wernher von Braun was the most famous in the USA and worked for NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and Sergei Korolev was the most famous from the USSR. Both countries spent the next decade launching satellites and testing spacecraft in the race to become the first to do things in space.
The first artificial satellite and first signals from space, Sputnik 1, October 4th, 1957, USSR.
The first mammal to orbit Earth was Lake of the Dog, November 3rd, 1957, USSR.
The first solar-powered satellite, March 17, 1958, USA.
The first to leave Earth's orbit and first lunar flyby was on January 2nd, 1959, USSR.
The first photograph of Earth from orbit was taken August 7, 1959, USA.
The first hard landing on the moon, which was the first unmanned satellite, was September 14, 1959, USSR.
The first capsule recovered from orbit with animals and plants alive was August 19, 1960, USSR.
The first primate in space, Ham, January 31st, 1961, USA.
The first human in space flight, Yuri Gagarin, April 12, 1961, USSR.
The first unmanned planetary flyby of Venus, May 19, 1961, USSR.
At this point, the USSR seemed to be winning the space race, and on May 25, 1961, U.S. President John F. Kennedy announced his goal that by the end of the decade, the U.S. would land men on the moon and return them safely back to Earth. The goal was reached 8 years later. On July 16, 1969, Apollo 11 was launched. 4 days later, on July 20, it reached the moon. There were 3 astronauts on Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, and Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. Neil Armstrong was first. When he stepped onto the moon, he made the famous statement,
"That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
Michael Collins was the only crew member that didn't stand on the moon, as he stayed in the command module. On July 24th, after more than 8 days in space, they returned safely home to Earth.
There were 5 more Apollo missions, landing a total of 12 astronauts on the moon. The numbers for these missions were 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Although the USSR had never landed a man on the moon, they continued working on their space program and achieved many more firsts in low Earth orbit and in building the first space station in April 1971 with the Salyut program. Pieces of the Salyut are still in orbit today at the core of the International Space Station.
Throughout this time, there was very little to no communication between the U.S. and the USSR. During the 1950s and 1960s, there was always talk of working together, but the Cold War kept them from actually doing anything together. Had there been better communication and diplomacy, would it have made a difference? Would it have been a good or bad thing if it had? We offer up the Apollo-Soyuz program as proof that advancements in technology would have come sooner with better diplomacy.
On July 15, 1975, The USSR and the USA both launched rockets carrying astronauts or cosmonauts into space as part of the Apollo-Soyuz test project. 2 days later, on July 17th, nearly 6 years to the day after the first moon landing, Americans and Soviets shook hands in space, formally, for many people, ending the space race. The American astronauts were Thomas P. Stafford, Vance D. Brand, and Deke Slayton. The Soviet cosmonauts were Alexei Leonov and Valery Kubasov. The mission was successful but short-lived. 2 days later, after conducting many experiments together, they separated and returned home.
I really believe that we were sort of an example to the countries, astronaut Vance Brand said in a NASA oral history interview in 2000. We were a little of a spark or a foot in the door that started better communications. This was the last time American astronauts were launched into space aboard an American space capsule until 2020. The U.S. shifted their space program to shuttle missions in 1991. The definite end of the space race occurred with the collapse of the USSR. Russians and Americans began a joint program called the Shuttle Mir in 1993. The U.S., using their shuttles over 11 missions, carried Russian cosmonauts and supplies to the Mir station. The program ended in 1998 following a collision and fire on the Mir station in 1997. Then, in 1998, the construction of the International Space Station began. It was finished in 2012, another international mission in space.
Because of the success of the Apollo-Soyuz project and later the Shuttle Mir and now the International Space Station, we believe that had diplomacy been possible during the Cold War, the technological advancements that did come after the space race would have come much sooner.